The gavel struck sharply. A cold echo danced off the marble walls of the federal courtroom, solemn, polished, and eerily still. The sound felt final, as though the universe itself paused to take notice. Behind the bench sat Judge Loretta Valland, a woman of statuesque poise and sharp tongue, whose ascent through the judiciary had been swift and merciless. Her reputation was carved not just from law, but from disdain, particularly toward what she called ceremonial soldiers and tax-funded pageantry. She believed in intellect over tradition, wit over silence, and power over humility. The courtroom lights gleamed off her gavel like a warning. Across from her stood Staff Sergeant Cole Harlan, a man wrapped in silence and steel. His crisp dress blues bore the insignia of the old guard, guardians of the tomb of the unknown soldier. He'd stood countless hours in the biting cold, unmoving, unblinking, a sentinel of sacrifice. His very presence felt like history had walked in and taken a seat, but Judge Valland did not see that. She only saw a man in costume. "Mr. Harlan," she began, her voice like ice sliding across glass. "You're here today because you refused to remove your uniform in this courtroom. Is that correct?" Cole didn't speak. He stood at attention. The same discipline that had kept him motionless during thunderstorms and funerals now wrapped his posture in quiet defiance. "Yes or no, soldier?" she pressed. "My oath," he finally said, voice low but firm, "does not end at the gates, Judge." Valland raised an eyebrow, amused. "This is a courtroom, not a tomb. Let's not confuse theater for duty." A wave of unease rippled through the gallery. Veterans in attendance stiffened. A few civilians looked down. There were whispers, like wind through old stone, shame, disbelief, fury. The prosecutor cleared his throat. "Your Honor, the issue is not just uniform protocol. Sergeant Harlan was on duty at Arlington when he was subpoenaed. His commanding officer requested a delay. The court denied it." She waved it off. "I don't bend the law for someone playing dress-up." Cole's jaw clenched. His silence spoke louder than any protest. This wasn't about law anymore. This was about legacy. The tomb of the unknown soldier wasn't just a patch of marble and eternal flame. It was sacred ground, guarded around the clock, even through hurricanes, even during terrorist threats. Men like Cole Harlan dedicated years of their lives to that silence, that walk, that ritual. They memorized every step not for applause, but for honor. And now, standing before a judge who mocked that, Cole became more than a man. He became a symbol of all those who could not speak. "I buried friends whose names I will never know," he said finally, eyes forward. "Their families were handed folded flags. They have no graves. I stood for them." Judge Valland smirked. "So now you stand for yourself." "I stand for the silence of heroes," he said, not a flicker of doubt in his voice. "If that offends this court, then this court has forgotten what silence costs." The room froze. A single tear rolled down the cheek of an elderly veteran seated in the back. Judge Valland, unsettled, straightened in her chair. "Enough. You will address this court with respect." "I've done nothing but," Cole replied. For a heartbeat, the air itself felt sacred. This wasn't a court anymore. This was a reckoning. And somewhere, beyond the courthouse walls, in the stillness of Arlington, the wind whispered through white crosses. The unknown listened. The murmurs began as barely audible, a soft rustling like leaves catching wind before a storm. In the gallery, a Marine Corps widow clutched her husband's dog tags, her knuckles white. Beside her sat a wheelchair-bound Vietnam veteran, face clenched in fury. They hadn't come for spectacle. They came because they heard what Judge Valland had said in previous hearings, calling ceremonial units pointless expense, calling their guard rotations a national photo-op. Now, they watched a tomb guard stand alone under oath, under fire, while a judge marked everything sacred. Whispers turned to stares. Court clerks fidgeted. Even the stenographer paused her typing. One young woman in the back, a Gold Star daughter, quietly filmed the proceedings with tears in her eyes. Outside the courthouse, word was already spreading. On military forums, on veteran Facebook groups, on live streams. Judge mocks tomb guard. Court disrespects Arlington. One retired general reposted the clip with 3 chilling words. "This will echo." But inside the courtroom, Judge Valland remained unmoved. She leaned back, confident, smirking, unaware that the gallery around her was no longer just watching. They were witnessing a moment that would define her career at Arlington National Cemetery. The flame never flickers, even in storms, even in silence, even when the world forgets. For generations, the tomb of the unknown soldier has stood as a symbol of sacrifice, guarded every second by hand-picked sentinels. No matter the weather, no matter the hour, the ritual continues, and Staff Sergeant Elias Ward had walked that path 21 steps. Pause 21 seconds. Turn more times than most. He had served not for fame, not for fortune, but for those whose names were never known, whose bodies were never found, but whose blood had consecrated foreign soil. Now, in a courtroom, that same soldier stood alone, his uniform immaculate, his posture flawless, even as Judge Valland ridiculed him. But far away, back in Arlington, a shift commander watched the hearing online behind him. The relief team halted mid. No commands were given. None were needed. They all stared in stunned silence. Because what was unfolding in that courtroom was not just insult, it was desecration. And the guards, who never speak during duty, spoke only one phrase that night: "Permission to stand with him, sir." The reply was just as solemn: "Granted." The next morning the court was packed. Judge Valen entered, with her usual arrogance, lips curled, eyes sharp, not realizing what waited for her inside. Because seated quietly in the gallery were 11 men and women, all dressed the same: dark navy coats, white gloves, medals gleaming across their chests. Each had served as sentinels of the tomb. Some older, some freshly discharged, but all bound by a sacred creed. Their presence was thunderous without a sound. As the judge began to speak, her voice faltered, her eyes scanned the room. The air had shifted heavier now, like judgment itself was present. And then Elias stood, calm, composed. He didn't need to shout. He didn't beg. He simply said, "Respect isn't given to me. It's owed to them." And he pointed not to the veterans, not to the gallery, but to a folded flag resting beside him, the one he had carried every night, soaked by rain, bleached by sun. The courtroom was frozen. Even Judge Valen's gavel seemed quieter. Now, the silence of the dead had entered her chambers, and it demanded to be heard. Elias didn't speak of rank. He didn't speak of medals. He spoke of a creed, one carved into silence, not shouted in triumph. "In Arlington," he began, "we don't guard a man. We guard every man, every woman who never came home." He described the ritual, not for glory, but for memory. The 21 steps, the 21 seconds, the heel clicks that echoed like whispered names across marble halls. The judge shifted uncomfortably, yet something in her eyes softened. One by one, the other sentinels stood. They did not speak. They saluted the flag resting beside Elias, not to make a point, but to honor what the court had forgotten. Then Elias said something that stunned the room. "I took an oath to never allow dishonor to touch those tombs. Today that oath brought me here." A hush followed. And for the first time, Judge Valen didn't just see a man in uniform. She saw the weight he carried, not just in his spine, but in his soul. And it pressed against her like the ghost of every soldier she had never bothered to remember. Silence filled the chamber, not from fear but reverence. The reporters, once poised like vultures, lowered their cameras. The prosecutor sat rigid, glancing at Judge Valen with unease. And Valen, she was no longer towering behind her bench. She was shrinking. The weight of Elias's presence, not loud, not angry, was too heavy to ignore. This wasn't courtroom bravado. This was honor incarnate, walking upright in spit-polished shoes. "I didn't mean disrespect," she murmured, voice uneven. "I merely..." But even her own words choked. She'd laughed at a sacred right, mocked the stillness that kept names alive. The jury watched her with new eyes. In that instant, the room realized she hadn't humiliated a soldier. She'd humiliated herself. One elderly veteran in the audience rose. "Ma'am," he said gently, tipping his hat, "you don't have to understand the tomb, but you damn well better respect it." The gavel, once her weapon, now felt like stone in her hand. She looked at Elias again, not as a man in trouble, but as a man who had never broken his duty. The next day cameras flashed again, but not in mockery, not in scandal. Judge Valen stood outside the courthouse steps. No robe, no pretense, only her trembling voice carried across microphones, to Sergeant Elias Ward, and to every soldier who ever stood in silent vigil. "I was wrong." Gasps followed. She didn't blink. "I didn't understand the weight you carry, the pain behind your stillness, the lives you hold in memory with every step." She looked directly at Elias, who stood in uniform among his fellow guards, their faces as unreadable as the marble tomb itself. "I spoke from ignorance, and for that I apologize, not to protect my seat but to reclaim my soul. No legal jargon, no excuses, just truth." Elias didn't smile, but he nodded once, a nod deeper than words. Because forgiveness, like silence, is sacred, the apology made national headlines, but not for its drama, for its humility. A judge had bowed, not in weakness but in wisdom, and somewhere in the distance, the wind passed gently over Arlington, as if the souls beneath had heard. The cold wind moved through Arlington again, but this time it carried a reverent stillness. Sergeant Elias Ward stepped onto the black mat once more, boots striking like a ticking clock. But something had shifted, not in him, but in the eyes watching him. Visitors no longer whispered about the judge's insult. They now stood in solemn admiration, having seen the deeper cost of silence and duty. Among the crowd, Judge Valen stood quietly, unrobed, with a single white rose in hand. She didn't wave, she didn't speak. She simply placed the flower by the wreath at the tomb's edge and bowed her head, not as a judge, but as a citizen. And then, she left. Elias continued his 21 steps unbroken, unreadable, unwavering, but something lingered in the air, a kind of restored reverence. A lesson had echoed far beyond that courtroom, that silence isn't weakness, that dignity can't be mocked, and that some oaths echo beyond the living. The guard marched on. Not for applause, not for redemption, but for the dead. Years later, schoolchildren would visit the tomb, guided by soft-spoken veterans. Their eyes would widen as they learned not just of the unknown soldier, but of the man who once stood watch, and the judge who tried to mock him. Judge Valen never returned to the bench. Instead, she dedicated her remaining years to advocating for veterans' mental health and dignity. She often told the story not to shame herself, but to show the cost of forgetting reverence. Sergeant Ward served out his final years with precision and silence, fading into history as most guardians do. But his name lived on in whispered reverence, etched in hearts more than stone. A plaque now rests near the cemetery gates. Honor walks in silence. Let none dare laugh at its quiet weight. And still, the guard walks, never flinching, never faltering. In that endless march, the past is remembered, the fallen are honored, and the living are reminded. Some men speak with words, others with footsteps, but the loudest truths, the end.